Okay, today I'm joined by two fantastic guests to review the year in sustainability for 2024. Like last year, we have the ever calm wise James Murray, editor or senior editor, sorry, of businessgreen.com. Welcome, James.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And new for this year, we have the OG, the original Green, Lucy Siegle, who you
Hello.
must know from The Guardian, The Observer, the BBC's One Show, Surfers Against Sewage, her campaigning on fast fashion, or one of her many books. But welcome to this session, Lucy.
Thank you so much.
Right, it's been a strange year. It started with an international squabble over whether the agreement to transition away from fossil fuels really meant to transition away from fossil fuels, and has ended with the launch of a very big, very pink electric car. But plenty has happened in between, so we're going to dig into that. And first up, elections. 2024 has been described as the biggest year of democracy ever, with 50% of the world's population having an opportunity to vote. There was a sort of anti-incumbency trend, with the notable exception of Russia, where Vladimir Putin romped home with 87% of the vote. Not quite sure how he does that. But let's start at home in the UK. We had the general election early July. Let's start. Lucy, did you think it was a climate election?
I did not. um, I'm thinking back now. It seems like years ago, doesn't it? But it was July. So was it a climate election? It wasn't. I felt like they maybe shut Ed Miliband in a cupboard, and it was sort of quite obvious, wasn't it, that anything that could broadly be determined as divisive, troublesome, just or real maybe was not going to be allowed airtime. And I think that a lot of people were understandably complicit in that, because they were seen as, having a job to do. And I think that a lot of the climate and nature movement subscribed to the job that they had to do. And the reason, obviously, because for that goes back into the last 18 months of Rishi Sunak's tenureship, because I don't think that you can try and play the anti-net zero card, given how many British businesses, which is formed of, largely of British citizens who will be eligible to vote. I don't really see how you can play that card and think that they won't want to get rid of you. So I think that, there was a sort of condoning of the green hushing, we might say, because there was such a desire to remove the Conservative Party at that point. And I think there was a sort of weird, quiet drumbeat that built, that was almost like, James will have a view on this, that, certainly from a business point of view, that things would be okay, and that there was some policies that would come through. And also, just thinking back, there was really the lack of the sort of industrial manufacturing, renewable energy strategy that many people thought, underpins the UK's net zero pathway or plan, that Labour had elements of that ready to go, or that they would show some green flair and backbone once they're in office. I think there was a sort of tacit understanding that you just needed to get them elected. So I don't think it was ever going to be a climate election, and I don't think it was one.
Okay, thanks, James. What was your take on the election?
I think I broadly agree. I think it, obviously wasn't sort of a front and center issue. It didn't dominate the headlines. It didn't dominate the few press conferences there were. There wasn't a huge sort of priority push on it. That said, when you sort of lift beneath the lid and you sort of look at the manifesto and look at actually some of the sort of commitments Labour made, they have arguably been elected on the most ambitious climate platform in the history of British politics. They have this hugely ambitious target to decarbonise, or largely decarbonise, the power system by 2030. One of the 5 missions that Keir Starmer tried to talk about was again focused on clean energy and making the UK a clean energy superpower. Even in some of the stuff that was generating headlines, the sewage crisis was one of these issues that cut through and does seem to have cost the Tories a lot of seats, particularly to the Lib Dems in the south of the country. And Labour did, quietly draw a clear dividing line with the Tories, who were hinting or flirting with the idea that they were becoming increasingly anti-net zero, and after the election have become even more vocally sceptical of the whole net zero project. So there was a sort of quite clear dividing line at the election on climate as well. So it didn't cut through. I think that's partly Labour's fault. I think it's certainly the media's fault, who just still don't treat this stuff nearly seriously enough. But you could construct an argument that sort of, beneath the headlines, it was a climate election and there were clearer dividing lines that there've been in the past, and we now have a government that has a mandate to do some potentially really bold stuff around particularly clean energy infrastructure. The slightly disappointing thing with it, though, was that it was just such a sort of narrow campaign from Labour, and this is not a particularly original analysis, but now a lot of the problems they're getting do seem to be around the way they just box themselves in on sort of tax and spend, and box themselves in on terms of being quite downbeat and not telling a particularly positive story. And they've discovered sort of 4 or 5 months in that they probably needed that fiscal flexibility. And if they want to cheer everyone up and get a bit of business confidence and momentum, then the rhetoric needs to be a bit better than just everything's terrible all the time. I think there was more climate stuff in there than was necessarily realised, but it's just a shame it doesn't get that sort of front and centre treatment that it arguably does deserve.
Yeah, I would agree that there was definitely an undercurrent, because when Rishi Sunak diluted those net zero targets at the conference in late 2023, his support took a 2 to 4% dip that it never recovered from. So this idea that somehow, being anti-net zero wins you votes doesn't seem to ring true. So, James, you'd moved on there, I suppose, to the next question, which is if Ed Miliband...
Sorry, can I just say something?
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, it's good that they tested whether anti-net zero pays off in electoral terms, but it doesn't, I guess. But I think that, just to James's point, I think there would have been even more clarity if, as someone who's involved with an ocean protection charity, I obviously look in the manifesto for, ocean stuff. And apparently it was left out by mistake from the Labour manifesto. That's what I heard anyway. So, there was a sort of careless element as well. And I think because the election was called in a hurry and stuff like that, there was a sense that they couldn't get all of their climate and nature ducks in a row. But I certainly noticed that omission, and I was like, where is that? Where is that? Because you know that they've done work on it, and you know that, like James alluded to, the fact that it was a really important doorstep issue for the Lib Dems. But it wasn't really in there, and apparently that was just a mistake.
Well, if Ed Miliband wasn't trusted with the Ming vase during the election, he seemed to get unleashed pretty soon afterwards. So if we go back to James, you're sort of continuing on to the new government's performance post-election. How would you sum that up?
Again, I think there's this real this real sort of paradox or dichotomy there, in that they've done some really quite positive stuff. They've got on and made some impressive changes that most people in the green sector would welcome. So we are, they moved very, very quickly to lift the de facto ban on onshore winds. They boosted the auction for clean energy for the latest round of contract for difference clean energy auctions, and they got sort of record levels of funding through that. The problem is that the levers of the state don't move as quickly as people would like in the modern era, but they are, they're consulting on significant planning reforms. They're still looking at really significant electricity market reforms that could have a big impact. They're edging forward with big sort of energy efficiency plans. There's a big review going on of the environmental improvement plan. There's an awful lot of stuff happening that had kind of stopped happening under a Conservative government that got increasingly dysfunctional and was just sort of hamstrung by infighting and just almost basically given up on governing in the last 2-3 years. And we should start to see the rewards of that going into next year. There's this whole wave of stuff in the in-tray that is being worked through, and the instincts of the government seem to be broadly positive. I mean, even the areas where they're definitely not doing enough in terms of sort of overarching investment, we're going to see GB Energy getting up and running. We'll see the National Wealth Fund starting to mobilise investment. And at the budget, Rachel Reeves did make these changes to the fiscal rules that give us significantly more wriggle room to invest more in public transport, clean energy, and some of these other projects that are absolutely critical. So there's this kind of undercurrent of really sort of interesting, broadly positive things that are happening. The counter argument to that, the worry with that is it's not being communicated particularly well. Again, partly Labour's fault, also just the inherent hostility there is within lots of the press towards, that basically has an idea that any Labour government's illegitimate and doesn't really like green stuff. So kind of they have a double problem there. So then they're absolutely not telling the story as well as they should. And also you have the constant problem with anything to do with climate change is that the good stuff is just never good enough. So a lot of the things they're looking to get right, whether it's electricity market reform or planning reform, they're just fixing things that have become sort of unfit for purpose and outdated. And what the fiscal environment means is we're not seeing is anything of that kind of really transformational. They reference it themselves. They talk about the post-war period of reconstruction. They talk about the interwar New Deal. They talk about, the world currently being an incredibly dangerous and volatile place. And yet the solutions they come up with are just not on a par with those sort of great historic periods of public sector, social change, investment that we saw. And that's the slight worry here, is that the good stuff is still not good and ambitious enough. But I mean I'm still firmly of the view they're not getting enough credit. That's partly their fault. It's partly the way British politics works. And I think there probably does need to be a slightly better sort of understanding of the scale of the mess they inherited, which was just off the charts if you look at the sort of the fiscal black hole, and the fact this stuff unfortunately will take time. And I just don't think modern politics and modern media environments give anyone time to fix anything.
Yeah, Lucy, have you felt it's gone, and maybe you want to broaden it out to some of the other parties post-election as well?
Oh, I broadly agree with James. We're in danger of being in violent agreement on many issues here, but I think that I can only really talk about it from, what I thought might happen. I thought I would be awash with lots more transformative stories.
Yeah.
And they're just not there. So I think if we look at the systemic issues with democracy, and we look at short-termism versus long-termism, as James has talked about, we can see that the firefighting and that narrative of what they've inherited from 14 years of Tory government, etc., is really sort of dominating, and just the things that need to happen which aren't happening, which are immensely frustrating. There is a good story around electrification and net zero pathway on energy, I think. I'm slightly stolen this from someone, and I can't remember who it is, so apologies to them. But within industry, there is this great narrative, I think, that the UK is fortunate in that it has bad weather and chemical parks, like the leftover ones from ICI. And it's quite a nice narrative, because then it sort of makes you really alert to all of the green tech and the system that we could have if we were to accomplish this net zero energy transition. And you've got, ideas that once you're generating excess wind power, then hydrogen becomes feasible for big scale industrial projects, etc., etc., etc. So everything is so joined, which I think James mentioned as well. And the problem with these very joined up stories are that, as James has also mentioned, we are really horrible at telling these narratives because they require complexity, understanding, buy-in, a sense of expertise and interest from the journalists.
Yeah.
And, it's almost like a compact with the reader. And, Green Business does this beautifully, but you've got a very engaged audience and, you're behind a paywall. So how do we get some of those stories through to the mainstream? Well, that's what I've always been interested in. And I feel like this real like rocket fuel that they have, sorry to pick a fossil fuel type of fuel there, is this opportunity and this hope and this dynamism that you can unlock. And I wish we would do more of it. I do think that within the sort of detail of getting to net zero, things like small scale domestic renewables are really important. It's a really important story, and it begins to show people how you unlock these different systems. And we are in a very consumerist economy, and I hate thinking of people as consumers because we're global citizens with agencies, and I really try not to use that word. But if you look at some of that story, you've got this amazing opportunity to go from being a pure consumer of fossil fuel energy into generation, into selling back. And we've got some of the structure there. And, it is important that there's more wind power and stuff like that. So Labour's unlocked some of that. The government's unlocked some of that. But we also have things like the spark gap, which is impeding electrification across the UK. And that's the technical point that the gas industry essentially is allowed to set the price for electricity. And somebody needs to grasp that. I know it's complicated. And the problem with this is the political economy, isn't it? Because somebody is always going to lose when you are making any of these changes. And because we're on such a knife edge financially or fiscally, I think is the correct term, then we're told, we can't really rock the boat. We can't do anything with that. But, I really think we are going to have to see the government grasping some of these truths and changing them in favor of the transition. And I think we're really unused to things happening in favor of the transition, which is crazy because we've been conditioned to think of it all as doom and gloom and not possible. And Labour has to show us a sign that it's willing to unlock some of these elements publicly, speak up for them knowledgeably, and create enthusiasm and dynamism around that. And I mean, Ed Miliband's really good at that stuff. So let him do it. Let him out of the cupboard. Let Ed out of the cupboard. Sorry, that was really long.
Well, you mentioned doom and gloom. It's probably about time we moved on to the US elections. There's been a lot of rending of clothes and wailing about Trump's re-election. But do you think his election is going to have a noticeable impact on the fight against climate change in particular, but other, sustainability challenges? Should we go back to James?
I go back and forth on this. I mean, you can easily create the narrative that, the macro trends, the competitiveness of renewables and electric vehicles, and the unwavering commitment to the transition from China in particular, means that he will not be able to derail it. That's your sort of upbeat take. I think a lot of businesses are working on that assumption. He's not going to be able to reverse the electric vehicle transition. He's not going to be able to suddenly make renewables not cost competitive, which they are now in the vast majority of places around the world. And he's not going to be able to, stop the climate crisis. People will still be visibly seeing these impacts and worried about them. And, he can't derail it on his own. However, that really is, I do think there's an element of clutching at straws there and sort of wishful thinking. And I firmly believe all that. I don't think he'll derail the transition. He will slow it down. And there is a very real risk. I was talking to somebody at COP29 in Baku a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying sort of the big fear is of contagion. is will other countries start to follow him? And part of the reason that the deal was done in Baku, the climate finance agreement was reached, and was largely deemed to be so weak and disappointing from almost all sides, is because everyone looked at it with sort of their hard-nosed approach to it and said, well, if we come back in a year, there's going to be an election in Australia where the right-wing party could mirror Trump and essentially make the election a manifesto, a referendum on Paris, on the Paris Agreement. There's going to be an election in Canada where, again, the right-wing party looks to be leading, and you've got Argentina that are flirting with leaving the Paris Agreement as well. So a lot of people would dismiss this as sort of fear-mongering, but it's not inconceivable that you have, by this time next year, 4 of the G20 countries in the US, Canada, Australia, and Argentina either openly hostile to the Paris Agreement or potentially even just quitting it. Mm-hmm. You've also got an election coming up in France where everyone continues to hope the firewall against the far right holds, but maybe one day it doesn't. So the big worry is just this risk of contagion, of the sort of the Trumpist politics being emulated elsewhere. And suddenly, if you have policy environments and political economies that are openly hostile to climate action and are full-blown climate denialist, you just can't dismiss that as anything other than a hugely big problem for the transition. It won't stop it, but it will slow it down and make life harder, and just generally cause trouble. And of course, the other big problem with him is just the level of volatility and unpredictability and the risk of other things blowing up, potentially worryingly literally, that again just distract attention from the big long-term threat that we face. Mm-hmm. And I think anyone who sort of tries to put a positive gloss on it is slightly misleading us, sadly.
Lucy, do you see any silver linings to that particular cloud? Or
no.
No,
it's a disaster. I mean, that's my view. It does move us into different territories. So, from a communications perspective, from a media perspective, it maybe is not. It gives an energy. So, I think, if we look at UK media, mainstream media, there's been a bit of a slump since, Johnson and all the sort of psychodramas and all the rest of it. It's like we were in a sugar rush, and people got really sort of like a bit antsy because they didn't feel there was anything to write about. And as a consumer of a lot of media, my habits were off the chart, and I'm not even bad. Like, you're refreshing your phone to see who's resigned or who's done this or who's done that. And this sort of quiet stability that's come in has impacted the media landscape, well, financially as well. So there will be some people who are quite pleased that Trump is back in the fray because they've got something to write about. And I suppose there's an outside chance that part of that will include discussion of his the wage that he wore, the war that he will wage on net zero and climate change. I don't even know if he would know the phrase net zero, but climate denial is back up and running, which creates a tension which parts of the media find useful to report on. So we may get a little bit more coverage. The other thing that I think, in terms of more considered criticism or dialogue about what Trump is going to mean, is that the debate will shift onto tariff and trade, and that is inextricably entwined with climate emissions and embodied carbon, and that could go a number of really interesting ways. But as James says, you don't want to be in the business of predicting what Trump is going to do, because God knows. And he will be locked in this tariff war with China, which is going to be very interesting to try and work out from a decarbonisation point of view, what that unlocks or what it impedes. But it's really hard to be sort of quite navel-gazy about it or to sound flippant, because so many people's lives are going to be absolutely destroyed by this evil monster and this authoritarian regime, which he's, been planning as much as he can plan anything. So it is, how can you balance human suffering against decarbonisation? I mean, you can't really, can you, philosophically, morally, or in any way?
Yeah, it is a difficult one. Somebody showed me some statistics that ESG investment accelerated during Trump's last presidency, sort of counterintuitively. And obviously, Texas, which is redder than red, now is the biggest renewables center in the US. And then you've got the effect of Elon Musk, who has converted Trump to electric vehicles. And given the recent flirting between Musk and Nigel Farage of reform, I'm wondering if reform are suddenly going to reverse their position on EVs. But if we move on then from democracy, and James mentioned that he had been in COP29, the climate change COP29, I should clarify, in Baku. We've also had the biodiversity COP16 and the global plastics treaty. Now, all of those struggled to come to agreement, I think it's fair to say. So I suppose the question is this sort of international agreement, these big summits trying to thrash out agreed position, are we always going to end up with the lowest common denominator as a result? Do you want to kick off on that one, James?
It's such a live debate, and it has been forever. I mean, I always go back to the idea that if you got rid of these summits or try to do them in a different way, you would probably end up having to rebuild them along pretty similar lines to what you've got. These are global problems. If you go down a sort of an approach that is not broadly multilateral, it doesn't have to be unanimity, but certainly with a very high degree of consensus, you just have this big free rider problem where other countries will just continue to pollute and because they're not recognizing the costs of that, potentially get sort of short-term competitive advantages. So I've always been sort of broadly supportive of these fora and the way they work, because I can't see a sort of alternative plan. I mean, they absolutely can be made better. They can be made more streamlined. They can sort of move more towards, as I say, a little bit more towards consensus and away from unanimity. But ultimately, it does come down to just sort of raw politics and raw economics. And if a sort of large enough coalition of countries that wants the more ambitious scenario is not really willing to twist arms and apply serious pressure to the small number of countries that are tending to block the more ambitious approach, then you're just not going to get anywhere. And the problem we have at the moment is a lot of those sort of petrostates, they feel more emboldened than they've ever felt. They don't feel particularly constrained by any of the pressure that previously used to be brought to bear to try and get them to agree to more progressive positions. And the sort of the leverage is gone. So that's why we're seeing weak agreements or no agreements, because no one can sort of bounce Saudi Arabia and Russia into doing anything it doesn't want to do. So they're not in a particularly good state. It is very worrying. It'll be interesting to see what happens next year, because the COP is in Brazil. There is a president there who is betting his reputation on being seen as more progressive and bolder on environmental issues than pretty much anyone else. The last few summits just haven't had presidencies that were particularly I think Dubai summit did better than people expected in some ways, but broadly you have autocratic countries and that don't necessarily have the capacity or the sort of the heritage in pushing forwards clean energy. And Brazil will be different, and it will be fascinating to see whether having a sort of presidency that wants to push harder on this stuff gets a better result, or whether you still have those sort of structural problems that the blockers are always going to block progress. I do always think it's a little bit of a sideshow, because it does come down to the raw economics. It is about the actions that are taken, the investments that are made, and ultimately the only way to sort of isolate the petrostate blockers is to stop buying their product. So, everyone does have to look to their own knitting to a degree and actually deliver the decarbonisation plans that can then neuter the power of those countries that don't want to get on board with this transition. And until we get there, you are kind of just sort of fiddling at the fringes of what needs to be done.
Lucy, if you could reform these summits and agreements, do you have any magic wand that you would?
Well, I do, as it happens, Gareth. So what has to happen is that we cannot, and I know this has been said before, but maybe with not enough urgency or determination, but we cannot have these baby men seizing these international summits in the way that has happened. I think that what we have seen at Baku is a breakdown or a subversion of the protocols, how negotiation works. I mean, the president was so lacking in judgment and moral fiber. You couldn't really parody it. And I feel like what's happened is that all of the well-meaning expert people who work in this space have gone there and been absolutely traumatized from all over the world. And it just really makes me think, how did this happen? How was it allowed to happen? When did we know it was going to be like this? I mean, just the sort of whitewashing in the days afterwards from the hosts about what happened and what didn't happen, and the breakdown in trust. I mean, these, as I understand it, and I've, surprisingly never been involved in high-level negotiations. So, I'm just talking on basically what people have told me and, interviews that I've done and all the rest of it. But, this is based on trust, this whole world. And to go and to spin, there's always an element of spin, but to spin outcomes in the way that I feel that Mukhtar Babiez has I just think it's really disgraceful. So in terms of what needs to happen is we need to have proper gender parity through the COP process, especially in the higher channels. I think that would help change a lot. I'm sick of being told that it couldn't happen, it can't happen, or it's irrelevant or whatever. I think, time's up on that excuse. It needs to happen. And I think, I don't know within the machinations, like how these things actually work, but, is there a system where we can have an equivalent role to a speaker, as we have in the House of Commons, or somebody who is representing civil society, future generations, Indigenous people who are not properly represented in the room, and is actually going to get a grip on these negotiations and get people to behave properly and to... There is a charter, there's a UN charter that governs not just the spirit of these negotiations, but what is important, what is not important. That should also have some mandate over who's there. Why are all these fossil fuel execs going to these meetings? Why are they allowed so close to negotiation? The whole thing needs to be detoxified. It is our architecture, it's our infrastructure for change. It's what we have. It needs to work. It needs to be multilateral. And I don't think that we can all just say, oh, it doesn't work, we need to do something else, because I think we are where we are. And the specific changes have still not been made. The other thing that I would say is, having said that, I think, again, from what I understand, the financial arrangements, especially on loss and damage, are clearly not working. And it's, a very small amount of countries who really have got to stump up the cash, like something like 24 countries for the IONs. And it's obviously not working. And I think this is where we're not getting enough input from people who know what they're talking about. So environment ministers from different states don't have a clue about how these financial instruments need to work, and they're not innovators in this space. And I think Davos I hate to say it because I've got a real chip on my shoulder about Davos, but I think Davos is going to be really, really important this year, because I think especially, James mentioned before how dependent we are on private sector money, investment models, all of that sort of thing. I think that we need the big brains and the big innovators to give some of their time, proper time, to this problem. And while we're all behaving like clowns at COP, we're not going to attract those people. I can tell you that now. And we need to take some of this away from ineffectual environment ministers and people who've got, been landed with responsibility. And Davos seems to be more successful attracting those sort of conversations. But then how you turn a talking shop into a process is something that, billions of hours and billions of dollars has been spent creating this whole architecture. And we need to somehow come up with an amalgamation of those two processes.
Yeah. I'm not sure we're going to quite solve that problem within the hour, but the next question I had on my list, because we're sort of running towards the end of our time, and I'll put this to Lucy first, because you said we needed a new cast of characters. Who would you nominate as your climate hero of 2024?
It's really hard to do this, to single out people, because there's a few really great people around. But I'm going to say Susanna Mohammed, who is the Environment Minister for Colombia, because I think that she has taken on deep fossil fuel interests ahead of Cali, ahead of COP16, and she's from a fossil fuel background herself, because she used to work for Shell. I find her really, really strong and inspiring, but strong in not a baby man, strong man way. Yeah. I find her really deeply empathetic to nature and people. I think she's a rare combination of personal attributes and political philosophy, which frankly gives me hope. So she's my pick.
Right, thank you very much. And James, do you have a...
It's always hard to pick one person, isn't it? Because it is such a sort of broad-ranging movement. I mean, from the business side of things, I do think the work that Greg Jackson and the team at Octopus are doing is really phenomenal, and that is just it's going to become a remarkable sort of business case study that I think will be studied for years as to how quickly and disruptively that business has emerged. And also playing that public facing role of advocating for clean technology and clean energy, and doing it really, really assertively and not taking a backward step. It's going to be fascinating to see whether they get what they want in terms of the electricity market reform, which is just such a big upcoming decision. Quite technical stuff, but potentially transformational if they get the changes that they'd like to see, and we'll know in the next few months whether they do or not. But no, it's it's an incredible story, that business, and they really have created a lot of space for others to follow as well by being so bold in their approach. Yeah,
and since you nominated him last year, and I think I hadn't really been aware of him as an individual. I was an Octopus. I'd just become an Octopus customer, but yes, the ability to speak up. I'm going to nominate, because I get to go in this one. I was playing about this for a long time. I think, like both of you, I'm going to nominate Michael Liebrich, if that's pronounced correctly, not least for telling the Tories that their current position is both ridiculous and electoral damaging as somebody from the right of centre. He wrote a piece on Conservative Home entitled "The Inconvenient Choice for Conservatives is to Recommit to Net Zero or Get Used to Opposition." And why I think this is important is there's a gap, that we've kind of mentioned before, of that sort of sensible centre-right point of view. And if that voice is heard, if that gap is filled, then the majority across the political spectrum here in the UK is very pro net zero. And I do worry about the current leadership's attempt to sort of shift reform rather than come back towards the centre ground. I'm never voted Conservative. I don't think I ever will, but I've always got a bit of a respect for Conservatives who speak up on this. So Michael Liebrick would be my nominee. Interesting podcast he runs as well, even though I disagree with him on quite a lot of stuff. I like the way he challenges thinking. Okay, next one, and I'll go back to Lucy again. If you had to nominate a climate villain of 2024.
Oh gosh, there's so many. So I think the president of COP in Azerbaijan did really poorly, as I've said. So Mukhtar Babayez and Jeremy Clarkson just is a standard nominee for me. He did an interview the other day about his ludicrous intervention at the farmers' march on inheritance tax. Mm-hmm. Of which there, is I understand, some of that, and I wish that there was more provision for tenant farmers in particular, but that's a whole different thing. But he started in an interview for the Times, for which he is a columnist as well. He started going on about how livestock emissions have no bearing on the situation because it's just, he said to the writer, it's just like you doing a fart, charming as ever. No, it's not, Jeremy. And I'd like to explain to him why that's not the case. And I did notice in that interview, they had to include, not even in brackets, actually, it said, this is not backed up by any scientific consensus. So good on the Times for running that next to his assertions. And, he remains just a pain in the arse, I think.
Right, thank you. And James, have you got a...
again, so many to pick from. I'm going to go for Andrew Neil, the broadcaster and journalist, and not just. He is representative of a certain type of kind of right-wing commentator and social media warrior who are, incredibly critical of every single sort of decarbonisation policy. And they're smart, they really do. They pick out the weakest parts of the climate policy landscape and actually the parts that do need addressing and some of the problems that we have with high energy costs and other issues. And then they, basically then move from that into condemning any and all decarbonisation policies. And of course, what they never, ever do is offer an alternative prospectus for decarbonising and responding to climate change. They never, ever get into the detail of what their preferred approach would mean. And I just find it incredibly frustrating and really quite dangerous because there is this backlash building. If Labour can't deliver improvements in living standards and can't deliver reductions in energy bills, I actually, going back to you mentioned Michael Liebrick's take, I think he could be proved wrong. I think you could see a sort of populist right-wing government that's anti-net zero being formed. If Labour can't actually deliver what it says it's going to, and perhaps even if it does deliver, that's what happened to Biden. He did deliver a sort of economic performance and still got turfed out. So I'm really worried about that whole sort of populist push, and I have particular frustrations with the people who, again, it sounds condescending, doesn't it? But really should know better, who are smart enough to look at this stuff and recognise that there are real risks here, and the idea that if you just say got rid of the zero emission vehicle mandate, the UK and European auto industry would suddenly be fine, and we'd be booming, delivering more internal combustion engines, and all the competition of cost-effective, low-cost EVs from China would suddenly disappear, and everything would be wonderful again. And it's just an absurdist argument when you think about it for even a minute, but they frame it in such a way that wins a lot of people over. So he's my
definitely put
villain.
him in the bin. Definitely put him in the bin. And also, the whole shebang of gatekeepers to the media that continually support him without testing any of his questions, without questioning him. And, we also have to think, I agree completely with James. I'm really terrified about the rise of the right wing and the way that they are seeking to capture the media and communications is obviously very worrying. But just that question, how would you respond to climate change then? It's such a good one. Can we make that our question for 2025? It's just like ask everybody, because you're so right. There's no other perspectives. In the past, they've fallen back on, it's a hoax, it's a myth. But now we've seen this shift because of the more natural disasters. It's really hard for them to get away with saying there's no such thing. So there's a limited qualification now, isn't there? So yes, but this is not the right way.
Yeah, we must do something, but not that.
Yeah, exactly.
Where that is everything you can possibly do. Yes.
And I must admit, I'd have more respect for them if they ever did spell it out. If they said, right, okay, we are going to increase taxes and spend billions and billions and billions of dollars in improving climate resilience. At least that's intellectually coherent. I mean, I personally think that would be very foolish, but they just never take that next step that is the logical implication of their preferred policy approach, and they're allowed to get away with it because they're never challenged on it, or never sort of effectively challenged on it.
Absolutely. Right, we're running a little bit short of time, so the final question is looking forward to 2025. Do you think it will be a good or bad year for sustainability, and why? Shall we go to James to start this one?
I mean, it'll be like every year. It will be a messy year. It'll be very, very messy. The world is incredibly unstable. The economies, particularly Western economies, feel very fragile. There will be some remarkably impressive progress made. I have optimism in the UK that the government will start to deliver some big policy changes that do start to drive investment in clean technologies. The shift, the demand for electric vehicles, heat pumps, all this stuff will continue to tick in the right direction. You will see sort of there's some really exciting breakthroughs going on. There's some fascinating work being done in areas like in carbon removal, in sort of cutting edge new solar technologies, new energy storage technologies. There's will be lots of good news to report, and at the same time, there will be this sort of gathering backlash. I think it will become ever more politicized. I think the consensus is gone. But it was always quite fragile, but I do think it is really, really fracturing everywhere. I mean, obviously gone completely in the US, but I think it's fracturing over here as well. And you will see, unfortunately, I think more and more companies that have set ambitious targets realizing quite how difficult and challenging they are, and not necessarily resiling themselves from them completely, but just having to push them a little bit, having to delay them, having to dilute them. And there'll be all those negative stories as well. So it will be an absolute mess. And we will enjoy trying to report on it and trying to make sense of it. Enjoy not necessarily being the correct word there, but we'll do our best.
May you live in interesting times. Lucy, your thoughts on the year ahead?
Yeah, I think it's also going to be messy, but I think in terms of the negatives, in terms of the battles, I think after a pretty disastrous spate of COPs and the Global Plastics Treaty, which we haven't really got into, we're going to struggle to keep certain people in the car that we're driving. And I think, there are some, brains and people with different perspectives that it's really important to have on board, who will just, their attention they'll think they can do better elsewhere. So I think we're going to have to really fight hard to keep the show on the road. I think Brazil will be absolutely massive. And I think that it will bring some restorative energy and focus. And I think that will build much earlier than usually happens with COPs. And what would be great is if we could start to see a spread of the workload so that, it's not just a focus like once a year. And I mean that for the media as well, who've been doing sort of incrementally better on reporting, but still there's a lot of stories that are not being told. And in terms of communication and how we kind of get together and keep progress moving, keep momentum moving, I agree that there will be some more localized progress in terms of you'll start to see UK manufacturing strategy and just strategy generally making a difference, so that we do see some of this investment into renewables. And we shouldn't forget globally that 2024, what was very significant was that emissions fell for the first time in the energy sector globally since the Industrial Revolution, which, come on, that is a big thing, but we're all way off net zero. So there are some things that we can kind of think, okay, there's some stuff happening here. But I think in terms of communication, I really want us to bring in a psychological element, like understand the period of change that we are going through and the resilience that we need to push that change through. I'm here today, I'm talking to you from Nottingham, and I'm at a community flood project where there's about 20 retired people who've built this most incredible resilience centre. People are responding to the climate crisis in lots of different ways. And I think 2025 must be that the year that we tell those stories properly, good and bad. We need to be more fearless, courageous, and all the rest of it, as we know.
Yeah. You both said messy. I had the word bumpy. In some ways, I think it's a good sign, because I think some of the problems we've been talking about is because push is coming to shove.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see the vested interests, like Azerbaijan and the United Arab Emirates. They're starting to realize that this is existential for them. You can see the sort of quandary the motor industry's in. And I don't think it's incidental that two relatively newcomers, BYD and Tesla, are dominating the EV market, because the others really don't seem to be sure of whether they're going to let go of the side of the swimming pool and start swimming. So in some ways, I think a lot of this difficulty and the pushback from the sort of populist right is because change is happening. So I'm an eternal optimist. I always like to see it in a positive sense.
That is nice.
I do think that, the point Lucy made about that, the peak of emissions, it's unclear when if it happened this year, if it's going to happen next year, but it's certainly coming very, very soon. Just structurally, the scale of the renewables and the EV deployment, particularly in China, but also in Europe. Europe's now at over sort of 50% clean power, well over 50% clean power every single year, and still growing fast. And I just think there'll be a fascinating psychological moment globally when those emissions do peak and start to come down. And it'll be really interesting to see, does that further embolden the opposition to this transition? Does it become even more desperate? Or does there come a point at which the investment flows and the thinking becomes, hang on, this is over now. These are legacy investments. These are declining. This is the growth game. This is where we're going. And and that will determine. And that's the whole ball game. That's what determines whether we get 2 degrees of warming or 3.5, whether we get a plateau and sort of a slow decline, or whether we get this peak followed by this massive global industrial revolution. And we're right on the cusp of it. It really is this is over the next 2-3 years, we'll start to see what that downward curve looks like. And things will get really, really exciting. And again, Bumpy's right, Messy's right, but it will get really, the psychology of the whole thing will change when you start to see that it's actually working.
Totally. And just on an individual level, what we're doing is we're rehearsing for change. And that's why I think it's really important. And I want, for me personally, in the work that I do, I want 2025 to come back to talking to people about individual responses, because I do think that's been really sidelined. And I know we all know it's system change that we need. However, these things don't happen in isolation. People have got to feel confident in talking about this, dealing with it. And they've got to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff and the right-wing baby politics. They've got to be able to call it out immediately. And they're only going to be able to do that if they get very familiar with this whole area, which requires more content, more communication, all of that stuff. And on a very personal level, I hear that BYD are bringing out a car called the BYD Siegle, which has literally got my name on it. So that's 2025 for me.
Well, I was going to ask just finally the question that's on everybody's lips. What do you think of Jaguar's big pink electric car?
I
I like
can't
it.
process it.
I think it looks. I mean, it looks good. It's bold. It's exciting. I mean, it's obviously for a very, very niche, very, very wealthy audience. But I think it'll be it'll be fascinating to watch. But I think the backlash maybe has come a little bit early, and you might see a really exciting change for sort of an iconic brand. I mean, they've certainly invested a lot of money and a lot of energy and a lot of technology has gone into it, and they are. You know, over decades, they are real cutting edge engineers. So I think maybe certain people are betting against them a little bit early.
I think it's the car that my Barbie wanted but never had, because I had a Cindy camping buggy, which Barbie's legs didn't fit in. So there's something that really draws me towards this car, but I can't take it seriously.
Yeah. Impressively ridiculous is how I would describe it.
Yeah, that was actually a really good way of describing it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. We're out of time, so it just leaves me to thank Lucy Siegle and James Murray for joining us today to review 2024 in sustainability and look forward to 2025. So thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.